Uncharted 3 sucks.
You wanna run that one by me again, Chief? Bro, I swear, if you guys don't stop playing with me. This is my Joker arc, okay? I understand what Kanye was saying. People have been telling me my whole life that Uncharted 2 is better than Uncharted 3, and I've just had to sit there and do nothing about it. By the time I started making videos on this channel consistently, I was past it, you know? We don't talk about these separately anymore. We think of the Uncharted collection, the first trilogy, all together. I didn't have the motivation to make this video. It was old news, you know? And then I watched one of Jacksepticeye's recent videos and
I feel, my heart cracked.
the video wasn't entirely aimed at Uncharted 3 or Uncharted in general. In fact, the section where he talked about those games wasn't incredibly long. But he did go somewhat in depth on his thoughts on Uncharted 3 and how it was basically dog water compared to Uncharted 2. And I guess it awakened something inside of me because I felt the passionate need to defend my boy. No one seems to stand up for this game, and it makes me really sad. I'll be honest with you guys, I have a bit of a bias towards Uncharted 3, and I have talked about that a little bit in previous videos. Uncharted 3 is the game that I credit with getting me into games in the first place. It left me bug-eyed as a 13-year-old kid playing at my cousin's house for just an hour, and that experience led me to getting my first console, and then my second console, and now here we are, 8 years later, and I spend like 30 hours a week making content on video games for zero pay, and all for sometimes only 50 people to see it, just because I really love the medium and talking about it, and I would love to be part of making stuff in it someday. And I attribute that a lot to that first game, Uncharted 3, and so obviously this game specifically has had a really deep impact on my life. But despite that bias, I do think I'm capable of explaining why I think Uncharted 3 is better than Uncharted 2, removed from my personal connection to it. There are a ton of games which I go back to and realize they weren't quite as good as I thought they were as a teenager. I think BioShock Infinite is a good example of that, but Uncharted is a franchise that I visit yearly. It's the only franchise with which I do so. I've played 2, 3, and 4 probably 10 times each, which is like 7 more than I've replayed any other game ever. I've definitely developed a better understanding and opinion on these titles after continuing to play them once I actually understood what a good and bad game was, and I truly think that this preference is more than just childhood nostalgia, so I guess let's get into it.
Yeah, don't wait for her, man. Don't wait for her.
A weird topic to start off on considering the spiel I just gave, but I do think it's an important one to begin with. Throughout this video, it might seem like I hate Uncharted 2. I really don't. I think it's fantastic. I just think that 3 elevates some of the things that 2 was good at, just that extra notch. That said, I do want to point out the 2 things that I think are the big shortcomings of 3 and how 2 does them better, and the first of those is story pacing slash structure slash uniformity, I guess. In the story section, I will discuss all the good parts that I think Uncharted 3's story brings to the table, which I think there are quite a few, but its story is undoubtedly messier. It hops from location to location very quickly, the story is more segmented off into a few different parts, and all of that does connect, but they do feel very different as opposed to Uncharted 2's clean, simple progression. They also try and throw twists and crazy moments at you from every which angle. Uncharted 2's story is definitely smoother, a bit more natural with how it gets you moving on to the next thing, and it feels like one solid, tight storyline. To that end, it's a much more technically well-written story, and in terms of why I think Uncharted 3 doesn't suffer from that too much, I'll get into in the story section. But as for the other thing that I think 2 does way better than 3, it has to be the villains. Lazarevich is not a great villain, he's like actually quite a generic bad guy, but he seems designed like that on purpose. Uncharted was always a Hollywood-style thrill ride, and having evil man be evil because power, that's just classic Hollywood, baby. Lazarevich gets the job done, and he can be pretty imposing and scary when he needs to be. You can't really say the same for Talbot and whatever the heck the other one's name is. The fact that this is maybe the single most important game in the world to me, and I play it every year and I still can't remember the main antagonist's name, is ludicrous. Catherine? The villain's name is Catherine? Catherine is not a villain, Catherine is the name of a Starbucks barista. They try to go for one of those more mental villains rather than a physical force where the fear factor comes from their power and how much they can do from behind the scenes, but she just ends up being this stinky pile of doo-doo that you never really think about, and Talbot is this weird smiling henchman. These are some goofy goober villains. Lazarevich isn't great, but he feels like Thanos next to these dudes. I guess Naughty Dog realized that their villains weren't great after this because they gave us 2 amazing ones in 4, one of which was basically what they wanted to do with Catherine. Except this time it was actually done well. But I think as far as 3 goes, it ends up as the worst in the series antagonist-wise, even worse than 1, because at least I remember Eddie Raja and he has some personality to him, even if I can't remember the other guy. Anyways, those are the 2 things that I think Uncharted 3 really swings at and misses, but other than that, I guess let's change gears and be nice for once. Let's talk about...
Yo, I'll be back, man. I'm just gonna munch up a little bit, man. I'm pretty hungry.
The core gameplay of the Uncharted franchise, that being shooting and climbing, at least if we're talking about the first 3 games has always been okay. People who say it's outright bad, I think, are overdoing it a little, but it was never the strong suit of these games. It was just serviceable. But I think Uncharted 3's gameplay was the most fun out of the PS3 games. The first reason for which is that it lessened the amount of time that you spent doing that core gameplay loop in its most basic setting, and instead pushed you into more unique gameplay moments with its set pieces. We all know how insanely cool the set pieces are in this game. To me, they're easily the best in the series. Set piece wise, it goes 3, 4, 2, 1, and that's a huge positive that this game has going for it, but this is something that a lot of people agree on, so I'm gonna be focusing purely on its gameplay implications for this video. I talked about Uncharted a lot in my recent video on linear storytelling, and a lot of examples I used for how story moments and set pieces can create engaging and unique gameplay opportunities came from Uncharted 3 specifically. The plane crash makes the cover system less reliable because your cover keeps running away from you, and the swaying ground impacts your shooting, which makes you have to adjust to that obstacle. Climbing here feels more intense, as it does in the boat scene where the sinking ship is also changing up your perspective all the time and has you climbing up walls, furniture, chandeliers, running on roofs, just making its traversal and climbing mechanics way more fun because of the context. The burning building does the exact same. Clambering around actually feels intense and enjoyable, and handholds snapping off feels more like it's part of the scenario and not just the game being an asshole, which sometimes it is. Even smaller set piece moments, like when you're getting tossed out of a window in a castle and gotta make your way back up while swinging, climbing, and using slabs of concrete that are jutting out of the walls as cover, and shooting dudes through windows. These set pieces add a lot of spice to the gameplay and sometimes reformat it a bit. And of course, Uncharted 2 does this as well. See the helicopter chase scene, it has a lot of the same strengths that these set pieces do, but Uncharted 3 has more set pieces, both large and small, and the set pieces are all way cooler and reformat what you're doing a lot more. So I think it ends up being a more exciting and more replayable product as far as gameplay goes. And as an added point to that, I also want to talk about Uncharted 3's chase scenes. I think the chases in Uncharted 3 have some really fun elements to them, and I'm sad that they were a bit toned down in 4. They put it in the Last of Us games a few times though, so that was pretty cool. Uncharted 3 introduces a few of these sequences where you're either chasing or getting chased by someone. Sometimes it's no one and you're just generally running away while tripping on acid, and it's basically a cool way to lead the player quickly through some fun environments and create what is basically a tamer version of a set piece with you having a lot more agency. I think these were designed really well. The one time I felt anything for either of these villains was when I was chasing this little weasel throughout the city and just getting pissed off at his cowardly ass who was running away from me scared. Sure, the chase is a little clunky by today's standards, but it still gives you that feeling of being just within arm's reach of someone you really want to grab, or you felt like you were actually under hot pursuit, and the game would close doors or get people to step in front of obvious pathways in order to have you turn to some less sturdy side escape route. The way it led you through everything was impressive because it felt like a chase through this massive area with these complicated routes, but of course the game is herding you into specific linear places. This is another example of how Uncharted 3 gave you way more to do gameplay wise than 2 and avoided feeling like a one-trick pony in my mind. And adjacent to that, I actually think this is the most enjoyable climbing is throughout the entire series. 2 had some fun climbing sections as well, but 3, this was way better overall. Not just because of these chases and set pieces, but just because in the environments they felt like they were real parts of the buildings or whatever you were climbing, and they weren't just random yellow slabs all over the place. Other games did that for short periods of time, but I feel like Uncharted 3 did that way better overall in the entire game. It's a shame that Uncharted 4 is the worst in that department climbing wise, considering just how much climbing is actually in that game. I've also noticed that I've knocked on 4 a little bit here recently. Just to go on record, I think 4 is the best one. I think each of them are better than the last entry. That's my personal opinion. I also want to mention that I feel like the actual shooting in 3 is better than 2. This is a hard one to pass judgment on because I am basing it on the remastered collection, and Bluepoint did slightly tweak some of the gunplay in these games, but after going through the same upgrades for all of these games, Uncharted 3 did feel better overall. The shooting has way more impact and force behind it, aiming and shooting feels tighter, like the gun actually has weight to it, unlike 2 where you felt like you were aiming a water pistol. They both have really undercooked hit registration. The way that people don't react to your shots and just slump over when dying is comically bad sometimes, but 3's combat always felt better and less floaty to me. Although in fairness, that might be a hot take, I don't know. Firefights feel more distinguishable in 3 and less like reskins of each other because areas are usually better with their verticality, and situations like sandstorms or floating platforms help make things feel fresh, although admittedly it also sometimes makes them feel a tad bit frustrating. Melee is expanded and actually has mechanics to it. Maybe they overdo the amount of fistfights you get put in, but this is the only game in the series where melee is kind of enjoyable and purposeful. I've heard some people don't like this aspect of the game, or at least how much it's put in there, but it's a cut above the rest of the franchise and I like it. I also like, by the way, how this was the introduction introduction to this game. You can't really top the second game's opening, so I like how this one is just a dirty pub brawl. It really shows off the more filthy ground level parts of Nate's adventuring, as does the entire ensuing underground railroad section. It's a lot more of this side of things than the quick jail scene in 2. 2 has some moments of Nate being injured and beaten as a result of being a badass, but it doesn't show him as a badass who has to go through the less picturesque settings and scenarios for a treasure hunter like 3 does. Fun fact, this underground section is actually the part that I played at my cousin's house and basically got me into all of gaming. I loved how cool but simultaneously dingy and unappealing it was. It was a visceral gameplay experience, and I liked feeling like I was getting my hands dirty with the adventure, even though I hate getting my hands dirty in real life. Seriously, I'm such a pansy. Finally, one of the least talked about parts of Uncharted's main formula is the puzzles, and I think that's because the puzzles in this series have never been good straight up puzzles. They're more like set-pieceified puzzles. They're more there for their grandeur and feeling like you're uncovering a secret by completing them. The actual solving of it all is never difficult, and in fact 9 times out of 10 it's just straight up written in Nate's journal. Pick up this thing and have it match with this thing, make the hands match with this picture. There's literally like zero thought involved. The most complicated puzzle in 2 is still straight up told to you. Make the green object from the book match with the green symbol from the book. Hallelujah. And 3 has a lot of these as well, no question, but it actually lets you use your brain a little bit more on a good chunk of the puzzles as well. This little hint makes you realize that the X gears and the circle gears need to alternate on this row so they can spin opposite to one another. This one requires you to use something from Drake's journal, sure, but it's not just the answer to the puzzle outright. You have to look at the picture and find where in the room the pillars actually line up exactly, and that gives you your solution. And my favorite one, you don't really get any information, but you see that these things move when you put the light down, and eventually realize that the solution is to cast a shadow in the right direction so that when the pieces move, the shadow forms the image of a man stabbing someone else. None of the puzzles in Uncharted 3 are as brain-crumpling as later parts of The Witness, or as simple yet satisfying and clever as what you'd get in The Pedestrian, but it's significantly better than the first 2 games, where Uncharted 4 kind of hits this middle ground between the two and also de-emphasizes puzzles a little bit anyways. Uncharted 3 is the only game where I actively liked the puzzles and didn't see them as just a spectacle and that's it. They never really detracted from the other games, but in 3's case, they actually enhanced the experience. I think I laid out a pretty decent list of reasons why I think Uncharted 3's gameplay is better than Uncharted 2, but of course, story is a big thing here, considering that's the actual main strong suit of these games, so I think it's time we stop talking about the gameplay and focused on
the people have only those rights which I choose to give them.
The story of Uncharted 3 makes no goddamn sense. I know this is supposed to be a nice video for Uncharted 3, but I have to preface it by saying the story of Uncharted 3 makes no goddamn sense. There's clearly explanations and planned plot points that were scrapped and they had a hard time redoing them. They cut out making Talbot's mystical elements actually canon, but they also couldn't change some of the mystical things that he did because, for example, some of them involved Charlie Cutter, and Graham McTavish, the actor, had to be written out partway through to film The Hobbit, so you couldn't exactly redo some of these scenes. I don't know why the whole pirate thing happens. It's very casually explained, like, I don't know, they were hired to kill him, even though if you wanted to do that, you could have easily done so at multiple points in the story. There's a lot of non sequiturs used as excuses to get people places, but ultimately, I think it doesn't matter much. And the reason for that is because Naughty Dog games, to this day, have always been about characters and not about the plots. The most universally praised story that Naughty Dog has ever written is that of The Last of Us. Do you want me to explain the plot of The Last of Us? Sad guy takes spunky girl to go see doctors and treat the world's mushroom disease, comma, murders everyone instead. There's nothing original or substantial or new about The Last of Us's plot. I mean, it's a zombie apocalypse story, for Christ's sake. The only part of the plot that isn't standard fare is the very end, but you know why The Last of Us is special? Tess, Marlene, Henry, Sam, Tommy, Robert, Sarah, Bill, Maria, David, Joel, Ellie, Buddy Boy. Every single one of Naughty Dog's games, whether they're directed by Amy Hennig or Bruce Straley or Neil Druckmann, all of whom have clashing visions a lot of the time, the one constant thing is that they're always character-driven and not plot-driven. So while you can point out a whole bunch of plot holes or messy storytelling in this game, that's easy to look past in this series if the characters are interesting, and to me, they absolutely are. One thing that Jack said in his video was that Uncharted 3 didn't have good characters, and this was probably the critique that confused me the most. You guys know Sully, the fan favorite character that we all loved even prior to Uncharted 4? Yeah, he's like an average character in 1, and he's basically a cameo in 2. Sully legit goes on one mission and then says, I'm too old for this shit, and bows out and we never see him again. His role in 3 is infinitely more interesting than the other two, and this game does like 90% of the legwork for getting us to love him. Out of the first 3 games, he has a nice role in 4, I do like it. But let it be noted that a lot of the more complicated sides of him in 4 come from the characterization done in 3, since the other two did very little in that department. I love this backstory for Sully and Nate and how they met. It fits awkwardly given the timeline shown in 4. Not to say it makes no sense, but it does downplay how important Sully would be in Nate's life, though that's not the fault of 3, it's just how things shook out. But I really like this scene because in it you can see how Sully influenced Nathan. Young Nathan seems like he's on a different potential path to what we see from his grown-up counterpart. Specifically, while he's clever and confident and intelligent and displays some real rapscallion behavior, he doesn't have that underlying heart of gold that we see later on. And we instead get to see that from Sully here. He's tough and not apologetic even to a kid, but he knows where the line is and absolutely won't be part of any harm coming to that same kid, even if that decision puts him into a compromised position. It feels like a really good insight into what these two mean for each other, and as the game progresses, we continue seeing that relationship thrive. And while I'm not the biggest fan of the death fake out, though the acid trip scene that ensues is amazing, I do think that this relationship is one of the main focuses of the story and is executed amazingly, and the supporting cast is just as fun. It's a shame that Charlie Cutter wasn't in the game more because he was such a unique character. He's this crass, almost thuggish dude who can be pretty funny and is actually really intelligent and can keep up with Nathan's ramblings, which Chloe and Sully never understand. He's such a great subversion of a character trope, and I wish the script wasn't forced to take him out of the picture because of the actor's other engagements. I like how Chloe isn't just eye candy in this one, and it feels like she's actually part of the squad, and this is actually the only time aside from the Libertalia part of 4 where you feel like you're actually part of a group of treasure hunters and not just a solo or duo act, and I really like those moments in these games. I think a perfect example of where people kind of split on their opinions on this game and why is the scene where you have to go and meet up with the other two in Syria after they haven't been answering their phone for a couple days. And it turns out that the reason that they haven't been answering isn't because something life-threateningly dangerous happened, it's because Charlie didn't top off his minutes because they're a ripoff, and Chloe's phone is broken, which seems to happen all the time and she doesn't care. And to me, that's funny, okay? I get that this is just an excuse for the game to basically put the player in a situation where they're not missing any of the action in the game, and I know that a lot of people think that this kind of writing is annoying and lazy, but to me it's actually very in line with the characters and the series. This franchise has always been about characters being absolute beans, just not thinking things through, being reckless and impractical. It's about impractical, immature, unprepared people who wind up discovering something incredible. Nate is very smart and he pieces things together for where they need to go and what they need to do, but he never goes in with a plan and he just wings it, and would be way better off if he actually thought about what he was doing for 2 seconds. So honestly, for these two to be incredibly irresponsible and not really worrying about something that's not affecting them at this exact second in time, they're just like, no one can reach us, but whatever, we'll figure that out later. That checks out to me, honestly, especially with these two, and those are the things that I like about this game. It sucks that Elena is the cameo in this game like Sully was in 2. I would have really loved to see more of her, and I don't like how she's a plot convenience, but the short time that she's there, she does make a big impact on the story and highlights a much more real part of these two's dynamic. There's so much weight in a scene like this where Nate apologizes for presumably running away scared from the relationship after they had been already engaged? Married? And while she seems all too okay with being back with him at the end of 3, like, there's clearly stuff you guys gotta figure out, don't be this elated. I do think it's beautiful seeing Nate say he traded his sick Parvis Magna ring, which was lost in the quicksand in the finale, for a better one. That's such an amazing moment considering what we know the Drake ring meant to him. Also, another side note, this ring, which I'm actually wearing right now, I got it 3D printed from a place to fit my finger. This is like my most favoritist video game item ever. I was so entranced by this thing as a child. Just the fact that it was this old relic that came from Nate's ancestor, whether that were true or not, and it had that motto, greatness from small beginnings. It was just so inexplicably cool to me. That motto is amazing and something that I really took away from this game. It doesn't matter where you start, you can always achieve something great. And as a kid hearing that and wanting to live by it, it was just so amazing. Like, this ring meant so much to me. So imagine my absolute shock when I realized that the date that's inscribed on the inside of this thing is January 29th. My birthday. After all this time thinking that this was the coolest thing ever, and then seeing that it was inscribed with my birthday? Dude, I swear to God, God brought down Uncharted 3 to specifically give to me. I think the reason that they didn't clean up the plot holes in this game was because they knew when I was going to my cousin's house in Windsor and they had to release it by then so that I could play it and eventually buy it for myself. I'm fully convinced that I manifested Uncharted 3 into this world. But to go back and wrap up the actual story segment here, I do want to say that while the plot in this game is messy and weird, there are undeniable highlights that prevent it from being actually bad, in my opinion. There's so many moments in this game that reach such a high peak, and even though it doesn't come together seamlessly, those peaks paired with the consistently well-written characters are what endear me so much to Uncharted 3. I also really like how the supernatural stuff is done here. I don't dislike the supernatural stuff in the other games, but it always shows up really suddenly and feels a little bit out of place. There's a lot more consistently weird stuff happening during this game, even ignoring Talbot's unexplained abilities, and the reasons for the supernatural beings to show up near the end was really cool, and was also responsible for some really unique gameplay moments, especially for the time. I think ignoring a few dangling plot lines and the weird wanting to save the antagonist thing that 2 did as well for whatever reason, Uncharted 3 ends really strongly, visually, plot-wise, and character-wise. I always love this ending. I think a lot of the attacks that are levied against this game, at least ones that are specific to Uncharted 3 and not about the Uncharted franchise as a whole because some people have problems with that, revolve around the actual plots. And to that end, I do get it. The more I play this game, the more I realize just how broken and slightly unfinished this plot actually is, so if you think the game is BS because of that, I do get where you're coming from. But because the plot almost doesn't matter in comparison to the characters in these games, even plots that are fully completed by Naughty Dog, they're not remotely close to the actual draw of the game, I think that the issues with the plot affect the game way less than I've seen some people say online. Obviously, it's all opinions, these are just mine, but in terms of what I actually really love about this franchise, Uncharted 3 has so much of it that I can ignore the plethora of shortcomings that it has in things where I don't really have a particular affinity for in this franchise anyways. The plot holes in this game are at most a confusing distraction to me. Maybe you feel like the game wasted your time, that it didn't actually care about telling a good story and just wanted cool set pieces and then designed a story around that, and that was actually one of Jack's complaints as well. But honestly, I'm pretty sure a lot of action movies and games are made like that. Uncharted 2, I think they put more effort into making sure the locations where the set pieces happened were less out there, making it easier to incorporate them naturally. The biggest set pieces in 2 are on a train and in a building. You don't exactly need a comprehensive explanation as to how Nate found himself in a building versus stowing away on a plane or a cruise ship. But I don't think that means that they wrote the story in a bad way or tried to cram a square peg into a round hole. I just think that the studio recognized that the plot wasn't the main appeal of these games, so it didn't need to be airtight. And while it would have been nice for them to give more thought on it, since to some people it does matter, honestly, I think they weren't exactly wrong. Seeing as how this game is very close to my heart, I do want to see other people's opinions on this. Am I just blinded by nostalgia? Do you really like 3 but think that 2 is a bit better? Do you actually think that 3 is the superior game like me? I know there are definitely a lot of people out there that have that opinion, but I just didn't see a dedicated video on it, so I wanted to put this out there. And I guess now it's time to watch the Luke Stevens video that I've been putting off watching because it sounds way more negative than this one. So, that's gonna be a great time. I'll see ya. Peace.